it eroded. So I think the choices, the explanation well, the answer to your question is that the choices we have made, as Professor Diamond says in his book, explain why we are in these different situations. When last time I taught development economics in the Catholic University in Santo Domingo, I ended up the class showing my students a chart that the Inter-American Development Bank produced on income distribution, by the way. But that chart was interesting because it was showing the average rate of growth of the last 20 years of all the countries in the Americas. And the top average rate of growth was for the Dominican Republic, 7.5%. And the lowest average rate of growth over the last 20 years was for our neighbor in the same island, Haiti, minus 5%. So when you have a situation like this, an ecosystem that it has been managed in an unsustainable way, a very high population density, about 1,000 Haitians per square kilometer versus 300 more or less for the Dominican Republic, okay? And the lack of job generation leading to this type of average decrease, 5% per year, minus 5% per year. Well, what do you have? Pressure for migration, political crisis. And in our case, we grow, but the distribution is not even. Therefore, this also is a source of pressure for migration.
But talk a bit more about income distribution. You said that income distribution is poor in the Dominican Republic, and you cited figure 150 to 1, which doesn't impress me at all, because in the United States, the salaries of CEOs are 350 times the salaries of the workers in the factories. And so 150 is very good income distribution as far as I'm concerned. But if income distribution is a problem, what are the political consequences of income distribution in the Dominican Republic? Are the people happy politically, or are they unhappy?
Well, you asked about the culture, and probably this is a good moment to talk about the culture, because just like...
You don't want to answer my question?
No. My answer is cultural. You will see. Bear with me, Ambassador. Just like in Brazil, the unfairness in the income distribution is more pronounced in Brazil than in the Dominican Republic. And you don't see social convulsions in Brazil,
no,
because people really enjoy themselves by dancing samba, by following football. You know, there is a peacefulness to our culture, to our way of life, that allows us to cope with this difficult situation. And in our case, at least, we have been able to enjoy the advantages of the release that migration has allowed, because the excess population has found other opportunities elsewhere, and then in turn contributes to our development. Remittances represent about 20–25% of our income into the current account of the balance of payments. So that's, I think, one way that society, our Dominican society with all its defects, has found to cope with the situation of income distribution. Our tax system is very regressive. It's not the most regressive, but it's very regressive because it relies too much on indirect taxes. Income taxes, for example, are mostly paid by the wage earners, and corporate income tax basically provides about 25–30% of all the tax revenue based on the income, unlike the case in the United States, which is exactly the opposite. About 2/3 is paid by the corporate income tax and about 1/3 by the wage earners. So we have a long way to go in building what the Europeans like to call the social cohesion of our society, by ensuring that our tax system is more progressive and therefore redistributes income through the social policies that we all like to implement more or less successfully. Here, for example, we're introducing finally probably the last developed country to ensure universal health insurance, and for that we have to credit President Obama and his team. But in the Dominican Republic, we have universal health insurance since many years ago. Of course, our hospitals are not as good as US hospitals. We have a long way to go to reach that standard. After all, most of the research in medical procedures and in pharmaceutical products is done in the United States. Most of the patents are issued here. But the fact of the matter is that we are committed to the fairness over the long term of our economic system, but that requires political choices that are not easy to undertake when you have a political system that is not as clearly separated from corporate influence as it is in the United States. And here, of course, every once in a while we hear discussion about campaign finance reform and so on. In the Dominican Republic, we have made many attempts, and still, it has been very, very difficult for the political system to achieve this clear separation between, on the one hand, a political class that pushes a political agenda supposedly independent from the influence of the private sector, and the private sector itself. There's still a very ingrained relationship, and this leads to regulatory capture, and this leads to undue influences when it comes to undertaking reforms. And in a previous life, I was Vice Minister of Economics for international cooperation and reforms. I had to implement the Uruguay-RAN agreements in the Dominican Republic between 1995 and 1999. The year 2000, I arrived in Geneva. The experience taught me, firsthand the lesson that really it is a very difficult proposition to push for a fairer economic system in a developing country when you have this lack of separation between the politics on the one hand and the influence on the private sector on the other hand.
But something is nevertheless happening in your region and in Latin America, and it is very palpable. You have, among your neighbors, you have Cuba and Venezuela on the one side, along with Bolivia and Ecuador, etc. And on the other side, you've got Costa Rica. And so there is a wide division of solutions to the economic and political argument in the region. And it appears, at least to us, and we may be totally wrong, that there is a shift towards the left which is taking place in Latin America. Why is that shift to the left taking place? What are the consequences of that? And how do you see it affecting you in the Dominican Republic?
This is a very, very interesting question, and you have mentioned several countries in your question that may not necessarily be examples of the same process. You have Cuba, and in Cuba we have a regime that has lasted for longer than I have years of life. I was born, and the gentleman there was already in power some 7 years, for 7 years before. And then you have Costa Rica. In Costa Rica, they abolished the army in about, I think, 1950, after a failed coup d'etat. But then you have Venezuela and Ecuador, and probably Bolivia is also an example of the same sort, in which the political class really didn't deliver the promise of a fair society. In the case of Venezuela, for example, you had two parties that basically took turns at the helm of government, and you have a major commodity, oil, that should have been used for the development of Venezuela. But it turned out Venezuela became the typical mono exporter that we learn about in the economics textbooks. And this situation benefited at the most 40,000 families directly. The rest of Venezuela didn't really enjoy the boom of oil. And the political class paid the price for this. An independent politician, President Chavez, first became famous after an attempted and failed coup d'etat. And when he came to the elections, he won. And he was won almost every election he has presented himself for, except